Most people think the deepest betrayals come with a bang, a gunshot in the dark, a scream of accusation, a door slamming on a life you thought you knew. They imagine a single seismic event that splits the world into a before and an after. They are wrong. The deepest betrayals, the ones that curdle the marrow in your bones, arrive as a whisper. They come with a gentle smile and a reassuring hand on your shoulder. They begin in places of supposed safety. Mine began in the autumn of my 16th year, in the idyllic, tree-lined town of Havenwood, Oregon, a place that sold itself on the promise of community and security. It started not with a monster, but with a savior. The rain tapping against the glass of my apartment window here in Portland is a gentle rhythm, a soft percussion 50 years removed from that time. The view is of steel and glass, of bridges stitching the riverbanks together, of a world that moves with an anonymous, predictable hum. My space is minimalist, curated. The walls are a quiet gallery white, holding only what is necessary, an orchid, its single stem arching in a perfect living curve. A bookshelf, organized not by author, but by the chronology of my own rediscovery. There is no clutter here. Clutter is memory made manifest, and for decades, memory was a luxury I could not afford. The silence in this room is a peace I earned. It is not the silence I was born into. That silence, the silence of the house on Sycamore Lane, was a different thing entirely. It was not peace, it was the breathless tension of a void. To understand the predator, you must first understand the cage. My childhood home was a testament to my mother's relentless ambition. It was a flawless example of mid-century colonial architecture, painted a tasteful dove gray with glossy black shutters. The lawn was a carpet of impossible green, the rose bushes pruned with surgical precision. Every object inside the house had its designated place, a polished, static perfection. It was a home designed to be viewed, not lived in. It was a stage, and we were the actors, perpetually under-rehearsed for roles we hadn't chosen. My mother, Eleanor Anderson, was the director. She was a handsome woman, her beauty as sharp and maintained as her prized hedges. Her world was governed by the unspoken laws of appearance. Status was her religion, and public opinion her god. She moved through our home not with the ease of an owner, but with the critical eye of a museum curator, her fingers forever ghosting over surfaces, searching for the dust of imperfection. A conversation with her was a minefield of social calculus, of measuring our family's worth against the Carsons across the street or the Winthrops at the country club. My father, Richard, was her silent, willing subject. He was a partner at a respectable accounting firm, a man whose presence was defined by his absence. Even when he was in the room, he seemed to recede into the furniture. He would sit in his leather armchair, the newspaper held up like a shield, the rustle of its pages the only contribution he'd make to the household for hours. He was not an unkind man, merely an empty one. He had long ago abdicated his role as a husband and father, ceding all emotional territory to Eleanor in exchange for a life free of confrontation. He was a ghost in corduroy, and his silence was a form of complicity I wouldn't understand until it was too late. And then there was me. Young Lily, a 16-year-old girl with a storm of thoughts in her head and a sketchbook full of charcoal drawings that felt more real than my own reflection. I was shy, observant, and perpetually out of step with the crisp, clean lines of my family's life. I saw the world in shades and textures, in the way light caught the frost on a window pane or the tired slump of a stranger's shoulders on the bus. These were things of no value in Eleanor's world. Art to her was what you hung on a wall to impress guests, not something you created from the messy contents of your own soul. A memory surfaces, as clear and cold as the crystal glasses on our dining table, a Thursday evening. The scent of lemon polish and baked fish hung in the air. The dining room was illuminated by a chandelier whose light seemed to trap rather than release warmth. My father was behind his paper. My mother was detailing the failings of the new caterer the country club had hired. Her salmon puffs were dreadfully dry, Eleanor said, tapping her fork against her plate for emphasis. Agnes Winthrop nearly choked. Can you imagine the scandal? My father made a non-committal noise. I had been quiet, as usual, but my mind was buzzing. I had received a letter that afternoon. I won the regional art competition, I said, the words feeling too loud in the quiet room. The charcoal portrait of Mr. Henderson from the hardware store, first place. Eleanor paused, her fork halfway to her mouth. She looked at me, but her gaze was distant, as if calculating the social currency of the announcement. Oh, that's nice, dear. She turned her attention to my father. Richard, did you hear? The Winthrops are summering in Martha's Vineyard again. I think we should consider it for next year. It would be good for us to be seen there. Whatever you think is best, dear, he murmured from behind his newsprint wall. The mention of my award was gone, an insignificant ripple in the vast, placid lake of their self-interest. It wasn't cruelty, not in the active sense. It was something worse. It was irrelevance. I didn't exist as a person with passions and triumphs. I existed as an accessory, a daughter whose primary function was to be neat, quiet, and not cause a fuss. I felt a familiar hollow ache spread through my chest. It was the feeling of being a ghost at my own dinner table. I would retreat to my room, the only space that felt partially mine, though it too bore Eleanor's touch. The books on my shelves were perfectly aligned. The bed was made with military corners, but in the drawers of my desk, hidden beneath stacks of blank paper, was my real life. Sketchbooks filled with faces, with hands, with the raw, unpolished details of the world I saw. Drawing was my only true language, the only way I could process the silent scream of my own invisibility. I would sit at my window, which overlooked the perfectly manicured backyard, and watch the evening darken the edges of our pristine lawn. I felt a profound and nameless loneliness, a yearning for someone, anyone, to see the person hiding behind the quiet facade. I longed for a sanctuary, a place where the air wasn't thin with unspoken expectations, where I could be seen not as the Andersons' daughter, but just as Lily. That was the cage. It wasn't a place of overt hardship. There were no bruises, no raised voices. It was a cage of coldness, of immaculate surfaces and profound emotional neglect. It was gilded with comfort and privilege, which made its bars all the stronger, all the more impossible to see. And it was this desperate search for a key, for a single person who would see me and value what they saw, that led me directly to the door of the one man in Havenwood who had a key for every lock. It was a vulnerability he could smell, like a shark smells blood in the water. My need for a sanctuary was the weakness he would exploit to build my prison. The suffocating perfection of my home followed me through the doors of Northwood High. The school hallways were a different kind of cage, louder and more chaotic, but a cage nonetheless. They were a roaring river of social hierarchies, a place where you were instantly categorized by the brand of your sneakers or the table you sat at during lunch. I navigated it all with my head down, my sketchbook held tight against my chest like a shield. My invisibility, a source of pain at home, was a survival tactic here. The pressure began to mount that autumn. It was a low hum of anxiety that started in my stomach and radiated outwards. College. The word echoed in the classrooms, in the conversations of my peers, and most pointedly, at my own dinner table. For Eleanor, college was not about education. It was about pedigree. It was the next logical step in the performance of our family's success. She had already decided on a list of prestigious East Coast schools, places that looked good on a bumper sticker, without any regard for what I might want or what I was suited for. The applications, with their sterile boxes and demanding essay prompts, felt like another set of standards I was destined to fail. My grades, once stellar, had begun a slow, quiet slide, mirroring my own internal retreat. I couldn't focus. The words on the page would blur, and my mind would drift to charcoal smudges and the expressive lines on a stranger's face. It was my English teacher who first suggested it. She noted my distraction in class, the listlessness that had replaced my former quiet engagement. "Lily," she'd said, holding me back after the bell, her face a mask of professional concern, "perhaps you should have a chat with Mr. Thorne. He's very good at helping students figure out their path." The guidance counselor's office was in a quiet wing of the school, away from the clamor of the main building. Just walking toward it felt like lowering the volume on the world. The nameplate on the door read, Marcus Thorne. When I knocked, a voice from within, warm and calm, called, "Come in." The first thing I noticed was the light. The harsh fluorescent glare of the hallway was replaced by the soft golden glow of a desk lamp. The room was nothing like the sterile offices of the principal or the school nurse. It was a den. Books overflowed from shelves, not perfectly aligned like my mother's, but stacked and wedged in with the comfortable chaos of having been actually read. A thriving green plant sat on the wide windowsill, its leaves reaching for the afternoon sun. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old paper. It felt like a space where a person could breathe. And then I saw him. Mr. Thorne rose from a large, worn leather chair behind his desk. He wasn't classically handsome in the way of a movie star, but he radiated an easy, confident charisma. He was probably in his late 30s, with kind eyes that crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which he was doing now. It wasn't the thin, polite smile of my mother or the forced grin of the teachers in the lounge. It was a genuine, welcoming smile that made me feel, for the first time that day, that I wasn't an inconvenience. "Lily Anderson," he said, extending a hand. His handshake was firm and warm. "Have a seat. Make yourself comfortable." The chair opposite his desk was as soft and worn as his own. I sank into it, the leather sighing around me. For the first few minutes, the conversation was standard. He asked about my classes, my grades. He had my file on his desk, but he barely glanced at it, his attention focused entirely on me. I gave him the hesitant one-word answers I gave all adults. Then, he changed his approach. His eyes fell to the sketchbook I was clutching in my lap. "What's that?" he asked, his voice gentle. "Nothing. Just sketches. I'd love to see, if you don't mind." No one ever asked to see. My parents ignored it. My few friends thought it was a weird hobby. Hesitantly, I opened it to a random page, a portrait of an old woman waiting for a bus, her face a roadmap of her life. Mr. Thorne leaned forward, studying it. He was silent for a long moment. I felt a blush creep up my neck, certain he was about to give me the same polite, dismissive, "That's nice," I always received. "The way you captured the weariness in her eyes," he said, his voice soft with what sounded like genuine awe. "And the patience in the set of her jaw. You have a real gift for seeing people, Lily, not just looking at them. There's a profound difference." The words landed in the hollow space in my chest and bloomed into a warmth I hadn't felt in years. He saw. He actually saw what I was trying to do. A knot of tension I didn't even know I was holding began to dissolve. He leaned back in his chair. A mind that sees the world like that. It must be difficult to squeeze it into the little boxes on a college application. I looked up at him, shocked. I could only nod, my throat suddenly tight. He gave a small conspiratorial smile. "I'll tell you a secret," he said, lowering his voice slightly. "I wanted to be a novelist once. Wrote half a book about a man who sails around the world. Don't tell Principal Thompson. He'd think I wasn't serious about my job." He winked. I felt a small laugh escape me, a foreign sound. In that moment, we were no longer a counselor and a student. We were two artists, two souls who understood that the world was bigger than grade point averages and SAT scores. We were allies. Our sessions became a regular thing. We barely spoke of college applications anymore. He would ask me about my day, about the people I was sketching. He'd ask about home, and when I'd give my vague, protective answers, he would nod with a knowing sadness. "It sounds like your parents are very focused on practical matters," he said once. The word practical, a gentle, perfect euphemism for the cold ambition that drove my mother. "They love you, of course," he added quickly. "They just might not know how to connect with someone as sensitive and creative as you are. That can be very lonely." He was giving my feelings a name. He was articulating the ache of my isolation and validating it. He was also, ever so subtly, framing himself as the only person who could possibly fill that void. He built a wall of understanding around the two of us, a wall that gently excluded everyone else. My friends, he'd suggest, were caught up in the temporary drama of high school. My parents were trapped in their own world, but he, Marcus Thorne, was here. He was the one person I could really talk to. I began to live for those meetings. The 30 minutes I spent in his office were the only moments in my week where I felt truly alive, truly seen. The rest of my life became a gray, waiting period between those bursts of color. I started drawing again with a renewed passion, not for a competition, but for him. I wanted to bring him my work, to see that look of impressed understanding in his eyes. He ended one of our sessions by looking at me, his expression serious. "You know, Lily," he said, his voice low and intimate, "of all the students I see, our talks are the ones I look forward to the most. You have a depth that's very rare. Don't ever let anyone make you feel that it's anything less than extraordinary." I walked out of his office that day feeling weightless. The noisy hallway didn't seem so intimidating. The future didn't seem so terrifying. I had a secret, a treasure that was all my own. I had an ally. I had a sanctuary. I didn't see the careful, methodical precision in his words. I didn't see that he wasn't just validating my art. He was validating my loneliness, nurturing it, making it a fertile ground for him to plant his own intentions. I saw a savior holding out a hand to pull me from my gilded cage. I didn't realize he was simply leading me into a different one, a prison far darker, with a lock he had forged just for me. The sanctuary, Mr. Thorne had built for me in his office, began to cast its glow over the rest of my life. A fragile confidence took root. I started speaking in class, just occasionally, my voice a little stronger than before. I stopped clutching my sketchbook to my chest like a drowning victim holds a life raft. The world seemed less menacing because I had a secret ally in it, a powerful friend who saw my true self and deemed it extraordinary. The gray, muted tones of my existence were slowly, almost imperceptibly, being replaced by color. And all of it, every bit of this newfound light, was tethered to him. Our weekly talks continued through the shortening days of autumn. He was my anchor. When my mother made a cutting remark about my artistic temperament being unsuitable for the rigors of an Ivy League school, I no longer crumbled. Instead, I would file the memory away to present to Mr. Thorne, who would shake his head with that familiar, knowing sympathy and reaffirm my unique worth. He was the antidote to my family's poison. My dependence on him became absolute, as necessary as air. It was a Tuesday in late October when he first asked me to stay late. The final bell had rung, its jarring clang sending students pouring into the hallways, a noisy torrent of relief. I was packing my bag to leave his office when he stopped me. "Lily, do you have a few extra minutes?" he asked, his tone casual. "I have an idea I'd like to try, something to help you with the college interviews we've been talking about." My heart gave a little flutter of pleasure. Extra time with him felt like a gift. "Of course," I said, my voice eager. My mother expected me home, but she wouldn't miss me for another 30 minutes. We sat in the comfortable silence as the sounds of the school died down. The roar of chatter faded, replaced by the distant slam of a locker, the squeak of a janitor's cart, and then nothing. The quiet was different now. It wasn't the warm, peaceful silence of our usual sessions. With the school emptied and the sun sinking below the windowsill, the silence felt heavier, more complete. His office, once a haven from the world, now felt distinctly separate from it. The closed door seemed thicker, the soft lamplight pooling on his desk, creating shadows that danced in the corners of the room. He turned his full attention to me, his expression thoughtful. "Lily, your art is incredibly powerful and expressive," he began, his voice a low, soothing murmur. "But your physical presence doesn't yet match the strength in your work. When you're nervous, you hunch your shoulders, you make yourself smaller. An interviewer will see that, and they won't see the confident young woman behind the brilliant portfolio. I want to try a small exercise to help you project that inner strength, to help you own your space." It all sounded so professional, so caring. It was an extension of his mission to help me. I nodded, trusting him completely. "Stand up for me," he said. I obeyed, standing in the small space in front of his desk. He rose from his chair and came around to stand before me. He was taller than I'd realized. "Now take a deep breath and stand up straight, shoulders back." His hands came to rest on my shoulders, his touch firm and impersonal. It was the touch of a coach, a director. "Good. See? You instantly look more confident." He squeezed my shoulders gently, a gesture of approval. My body registered the touch, but my mind, conditioned to please him, accepted it as part of the lesson. He walked behind me. The core of our posture is here, he said, and I felt the warmth of his hand press against the small of my back. A strange, cold jolt went through me. It was a completely unexpected sensation. His hand was large and warm, and it rested there for a moment too long. A silent alarm bell went off somewhere deep inside me, a primal instinct, but I immediately silenced it. This is Mr. Thorne. He's helping me. I'm just being sensitive. Don't be weird. You hold all your tension in your shoulders, he murmured, his voice close to my ear now. His hands moved back up, kneading the muscles at the base of my neck. You have to learn to let that go. His fingers were strong. It should have been relaxing, but my entire body had gone rigid. Why do I feel like this? This is wrong. It feels wrong. The thought was a frantic whisper in my mind, but I couldn't give it a voice. To pull away would be to insult him, to reject his help. It would shatter the precious, fragile connection we had. He would think I was ungrateful, that I didn't trust him, so I stood there, a statue, while his hands continued their slow, methodical work. He dismissed the touch as fatherly affection, a way of showing he cared about my success. My confusion was a thick fog in my brain. He was my savior, the one person who understood me. My feelings of discomfort had to be my fault, a product of my own awkwardness. Then he moved to stand in front of me again. The energy has to flow, he said, his voice a hypnotic drone. He took my arm, his fingers tracing a line from my wrist to my shoulder. You have to open yourself up to the world. The touch was no longer clinical. It was a slow, deliberate caress. I couldn't breathe. My gaze dropped to the patterned rug on the floor, focusing on a single brown swirl in the wool. If I could just stare at that swirl, maybe the rest of this wouldn't be happening. My mind began to float away, detaching from my rigid body. I could feel his hands on me, but it was as if it were happening to someone else, a girl in a movie I was watching from a great distance. He stepped closer, and the faint, pleasant scent of coffee on his breath was suddenly suffocating. You have to trust the process, Lily, he whispered. You have to trust me. And because I trusted him more than I trusted myself, more than I trusted the screaming voice of my own instincts, I did not move. I did not speak. I did not resist as he guided me backwards, towards the worn leather sofa against the wall. I did not resist when he followed me down into its soft cushions. The world became a blur of tweed and the suffocating scent of old paper, and the horrifying, gentle murmur of his voice telling me I was strong, that this was for my own good, while he initiated the first, unforgivable act of violation. My mind shattered into a million silent pieces. I was no longer in the room. I was floating near the ceiling, watching a horror show. I saw a girl with my face, her eyes wide and blank, her body frozen. I saw a man who looked like a trusted counselor, his face a mask of serene concentration, methodically breaking her. The lamplight caught the silver of his watch. The books on the shelves stood as silent, indifferent witnesses. The sanctuary had revealed its true nature. It was a soundproof room. It was a tomb. When it was over, he stood up and straightened his tie, his movements calm and unhurried. He looked down at me, the girl still frozen on the couch, and he gave me a small, encouraging smile. See, he said softly, you're much stronger than you think. He turned and walked back to his desk as if he had just finished a perfectly normal meeting. The door remained closed. The soft light continued to glow, but the air had been permanently poisoned. My mind slowly, tentatively, seeped back into my body, bringing with it a terror so vast and absolute that it had no sound. I was trapped. I stared at the closed door, my face a silent, screaming mask, the first crack of my life splitting open into a chasm from which I would never truly escape. The walk home from his office was a journey through a foreign country, the familiar streets of Havenwood, the cheerful yellow of the fallen maple leaves, the scent of wood smoke from a distant chimney. It all seemed like a badly constructed movie set. Nothing felt real. My own body was a strange, heavy machine that I had to consciously operate. Left foot, right foot. My mind, the part that had floated to the ceiling of his office, had not fully returned. It hovered somewhere behind my eyes, watching the world through a thick, sound-dampening pane of glass. When I walked through the front door of my house, the scent of lemon polish was an assault. My mother was in the living room, arranging a new bouquet of stiff, scentless carnations in a crystal vase. She glanced up, her eyes doing a quick, critical scan of my appearance. "You're late," she said. It wasn't a question, it was an accusation. "Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. Go wash up." There was no, "How was your day?" No, "Did you have a good talk with Mr. Thorne?" There was only the schedule, the routine, the seamless continuation of the performance. I nodded mutely and climbed the stairs to my room. I closed the door and leaned against it, my body trembling. I felt profoundly, irrevocably dirty, a stain on the pristine white carpet of my own bedroom. I stripped off my clothes, dropping them in a pile as if they were contaminated, and stood under the shower for a long time, the water as hot as I could stand it, scrubbing my skin until it was raw. But it was a filth that water couldn't touch. That day marked the beginning of the new routine. The abuse became a regular, scheduled part of my life. The word abuse didn't exist in my mind then. It was our work, our special sessions, our confidence building. The terms were his, and his language became my reality. The sessions would always start with talk. He would ask about my classes, about my parents. He would praise a new sketch if I had one. He would reaffirm our unique bond. Then, his voice would lower, he would close the blinds, and the other part of the session would begin. Each time, I would feel that same cold, sickening jolt of dread, and each time I would stand, or sit, or lie down, and allow it to happen. To resist felt impossible. Resisting would mean acknowledging the horror of it, and my mind was not strong enough for that. Resisting would mean angering him, my only ally. My survival depended on his approval, and so I paid for it with my silence and my submission. The sickness began to seep into every corner of my life. At school, I became a ghost. I'd sit in class, staring at the teacher, my mind a complete blank. The words they spoke were just sounds, disconnected from meaning. Once, in trigonometry, Mr. Davison called on me. The entire class turned to look. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs, but I had no idea what he had asked. I could only see the impatience in his eyes, the pity in the eyes of the girl next to me. The silence stretched on until he finally sighed and said, "Anyone else?" The shame was a physical heat that consumed me. After that, I chose a seat in the back of every classroom, hoping to disappear. My grades, once a source of quiet pride, went into a free fall. I couldn't read a chapter in a history book without my mind going numb. The words would swim before my eyes, meaningless black squiggles on a white page. My homework went undone. The red marks on my returned papers were like brands, marking me as a failure. The one part of me that had been truly mine, my art, withered and died. I stopped carrying my sketchbook. The idea of looking at someone, of trying to see them with the intensity required to draw them, was unbearable. Looking at people felt dangerous. My pencils lay untouched in their box. My desk, once a chaotic mess of charcoal sticks, erasers, and half-finished drawings, was now as neat and sterile as the rest of the house. The emptiness was a relief. To create, you must feel. I was doing everything in my power to feel nothing at all. Of course, my parents noticed, or rather, Eleanor noticed the results. My failing grades were an unacceptable blemish on the family portrait she was so carefully curating. She summoned me to the living room one evening after receiving a call from the school. My father was there, hidden behind his newspaper as always. "I had a very embarrassing phone call today, Lily," she began, her voice dangerously calm. "From Principal Thompson. He tells me you are in danger of failing 3 of your classes." 3. What do you have to say for yourself? I stared at my hands, laced together in my lap. "I don't know." "You don't know?" Her voice sharpened. "That is not an answer. We give you everything, this beautiful home, the best clothes, a generous allowance, and this is how you repay us? By throwing your future away? Your father and I are working very hard to get you into a good school, and you're busy. What? Daydreaming?" My father lowered his paper an inch. His eyes, full of a weary disappointment, met mine for a second before flicking away. "Do what your mother says, Lily," he mumbled, and the paper went back up, a final, impenetrable wall. I want you to go to your room and think about the shame you are bringing upon this family, Eleanor said, her voice like ice. Whatever this sullen teenage phase is, it ends now. I will not have it. I fled, her words chasing me up the stairs. She saw my pain not as a symptom of a wound, but as an act of rebellion, a willful inconvenience. The next day, I entered Mr. Thorne's office. My shoulders slumped under the weight of my mother's disapproval. He saw it immediately. That was his gift. "Rough day?" he asked gently, gesturing for me to take a seat. Tears I hadn't been able to shed in front of my mother pricked at the back of my eyes. I told him about the phone call, about my mother's anger. I didn't tell him the cause of my failing grades, of course. The cause was sitting right in front of me. He listened patiently, his expression a perfect blend of sympathy and concern. When I finished, he leaned forward, his hands clasped on his desk. "Lily," he said, his voice low and earnest, "this is exactly what I've been talking about. They don't understand you. They don't see the pressure you're under. They just see the results, the grades, the report cards. They don't see the sensitive, brilliant girl who is struggling to navigate a world that doesn't appreciate her." He paused, letting the words sink in. "That is why our work here is so important. I am the only one who sees your pain. I am the only one who can help you through this. When you are feeling weak, when they are making you feel small, you have to remember that you have this place. You have me. What we do here? It's to make you stronger. It's our secret weapon to help you endure them. You see that, don't you? We're in this together." And in that moment, I believed him. The world he painted was the one that made sense. My parents were the enemy. My friends were distractions. He was the sanctuary. The abuse was not the cause of my sickness. It was the cure. The nausea I felt, the exhaustion, the terror, those were my own failings. The things he did were the medicine, a bitter pill I had to swallow to get better. I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window after he'd closed the blinds. A pale, haunted girl stared back at me, her eyes wide and empty. I didn't recognize her. The sickness was no longer a secret I was keeping. The sickness was me. The secret sickness had its own rhythm, a tide of dread that ebbed and flowed with the school week. The days leading up to my sessions with Mr. Thorne were a slow, creeping nausea. The days after were a hollowed-out landscape of gray exhaustion. I learned to live with the constant, low-grade hum of fear. It became the soundtrack to my life. The abuse continued, a scheduled, methodical desecration of what little was left of me, always framed by him as the necessary, painful path to my own strength. I was so lost in the fog of his manipulation that I no longer questioned it. I simply endured. Then the sickness changed. It was subtle at first. A new wave of nausea would greet me in the mornings, sharper and more demanding than the usual dread. A bone-deep weariness settled into my limbs, a fatigue so profound that climbing the stairs to my room felt like scaling a mountain. I dismissed it all as a deepening of my existing condition, a sign that I was getting worse, that I needed his help more than ever. I was a patient, and these were just symptoms of my mysterious, shameful illness. The weeks bled into one another until a new kind of fear, cold and specific, began to prick at the edges of my consciousness. It started as a small, nagging thought, a question of dates and calendars I tried to push away. My body, which I had learned to disconnect from, was sending a signal I could no longer ignore. My period, always predictable, was late. At first, I told myself it was the stress. My life was a knot of anxiety. Of course, my body was reacting. But a week passed, then 10 days, then 2 weeks. The denial became a thinner and thinner shield against a certainty that was growing in the pit of my stomach. The nausea in the mornings was now a constant companion. The secret sickness had a new, terrifying name, a name I couldn't yet bring myself to whisper even in the privacy of my own mind. The decision to buy the test was an act of sheer terror. It took me 3 days to work up the courage. I walked to the drugstore in the next town over, a place where no one would know me. The box felt like it was burning a hole in my hand as I carried it to the counter. I kept my head down, my hair a curtain over my face, mumbling as I paid the cashier, my cheeks on fire with a shame so intense it felt like a physical fever. I was sure everyone in the store knew. I was sure the word "damaged" was written across my forehead. Back home, I locked myself in the upstairs bathroom, a room as sterile and unforgiving as a laboratory. The cool white tiles, polished chrome fixtures, and the scent of antiseptic cleaner offered no comfort. It was a room for exposing flaws, not for hiding them. My hands trembled so violently I could barely open the box. The plastic stick inside looked alien and clinical. The folded paper of instructions seemed to be written in a foreign language. I read them 3 times, my heart hammering against my ribs with a frantic, trapped rhythm. Every creak of the house, every footstep in the hall sent a jolt of panic through me. The 3 minutes of waiting were the longest of my life. I couldn't look at the little plastic stick lying on the white porcelain of the sink. Instead, I stared at my reflection in the mirror above it. A stranger stared back. Her face was pale and thin, her eyes huge and dark, ringed with the smudges of sleepless nights. There was no light in them. There was no art, no hope, no girl I recognized. There was only fear. Time was up. With a shaking hand, I picked up the stick. There it was. Not 1 line, but 2. 2 stark, pink, undeniable lines, the verdict. The air rushed out of my lungs in a silent gasp. The clean, white-tiled room seemed to tilt, the floor dropping away from me. This was not a feeling. This was not a symptom of my supposed emotional fragility. This was a fact, a biological, irrefutable fact. A tiny life, a consequence, was growing inside my body. The violation was no longer a secret memory I could try to bury or dissociate from. It had become a part of me. It was real. It had a heartbeat. The sheer absolute terror of it was so immense, so all-consuming, that something inside me snapped. The fog of confusion, the years of his careful conditioning, the layers of shame and self-blame, it was all burned away in an instant by the white-hot fire of my panic. And in its place, for the first time, a flicker of something else ignited. It was a pure, clean, clarifying rage. My gaze fell on my own stomach, flat beneath my sweater. My hand rose hesitantly and rested there. He did this to me. The thought was as sharp and clear as a shard of glass. It cut through everything. It wasn't our work. It wasn't a cure. It wasn't my fault. He, Marcus Thorne, the trusted counselor, the kind-eyed savior, had put this thing inside me. He had planted his crime in the center of my being. The lie was shattered. The sanctuary was a hunting ground. The savior was a monster. The passivity that had held me captive for months evaporated. I couldn't hide this. I couldn't endure it. I couldn't dissociate from a growing life. The problem was no longer a ghost in my mind. It was a ticking clock in my womb. Action was no longer a choice. It was the only possible path to survival. I have to tell someone. The thought was not a whisper. It was a scream. I had to tell someone who would believe me. I had to make it stop. He had to be stopped. The world had to know who he was. I looked down at the plastic stick in my hand, this small object that had delivered my death sentence. But as I stared at the 2 pink lines, I realized it had also, paradoxically, given me back a weapon I thought I'd lost forever, my own voice. The terror was still there, a cold, heavy stone in my gut. But now, it had a companion, a desperate, ragged, and ferocious resolve. My next confession would not be in the dark, whispered confines of his office. It would be in the light, and it would not be a confession of my own weakness, but of his crime. The resolve I had found in the cold, white bathroom was a fragile, trembling thing. It was the desperate courage of a cornered animal. It propelled me out of the house the next morning, my purpose a hard, cold knot in my stomach. Walking through the crowded hallways of Northwood High was an entirely new form of torture. Before, I had sought invisibility. Now I felt hideously exposed. Every laugh, every sidelong glance felt directed at me. I was a carrier of a toxic secret, and I was sure everyone could see it, a dark aura radiating from my skin. My target was the main administration wing, a part of the school I had always avoided. The door to Principal Thompson's office was heavy, solid oak, designed to project an aura of unbreachable authority. His secretary, a woman with a helmet of sprayed hair and a perpetually suspicious expression, looked up as I approached. I need to see Principal Thompson, I said, my voice barely a whisper. Do you have an appointment? She asked, her tone implying that my unannounced presence was a serious breach of protocol. It's an emergency. The word felt both melodramatic and pitifully inadequate. She sighed, a long, put-upon sound, and spoke into her intercom. A moment later, a terse voice crackled back. Send her in. Principal Thompson's office was the polar opposite of Mr. Thorne's. Where Thorne's room had been a den of feigned warmth and intimacy, this was a chamber of cold power. A vast, polished mahogany desk separated him from the world, a fortress behind which he sat enthroned. The walls were covered not with books or art, but with framed diplomas and plaques celebrating civic achievements. The two chairs facing his desk were stiff, upright, and uncomfortable. The air was still and smelled faintly of floor wax. It was a room that made you feel small. Principal Thompson himself was a man who seemed to have been born in a suit. He was in his 50s, with thinning gray hair combed precisely across his scalp and wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He did not rise as I entered. He simply watched me approach over the top of his spectacles, his expression one of weary impatience. He gestured to one of the chairs. Sit. I sat on the edge of the chair, my hands twisting the strap of my book bag in my lap. I had rehearsed the words in my head 100 times, but now, under his cold gaze, my mind went blank. The silence stretched, filled only by the quiet ticking of a large clock on the wall. Well? He prompted, his voice sharp. The secretary said it was an emergency. I have a budget meeting in 10 minutes. The words came out in a choked, fragmented rush. It's about Mr. Thorne. At the mention of the name, his posture shifted slightly. It was almost imperceptible, a slight stiffening of his shoulders. What about Mr. Thorne? For the last few months, in his office, I faltered, the shame closing my throat. I took a ragged breath and forced myself to meet his eyes. He hurt me. He's been hurting me. I told him everything. The confidence-building exercises, the after-school sessions, the way he'd manipulated me. The words tumbled out, disjointed and raw. His face remained a perfect, unreadable mask. He did not interrupt. He simply steepled his fingers and listened, his eyes never leaving my face. When I finally ran out of words, the confession of the physical abuse hung in the sterile air between us. Then, I delivered the final blow. I'm pregnant, I whispered, the words tasting like poison. For the first time, his expression changed. It wasn't shock. It wasn't empathy. It was a flicker of something else. Calculation. His eyes darted to the closed office door, then back to me. The ticking of the clock on the wall seemed to grow louder, each second a judgment. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, drained of all emotion. Mr. Thorne? He repeated, as if tasting the name. Marcus Thorne? Lily, he has been a counselor at this school for over a decade. He is one of our most respected, most decorated faculty members. He sits on the board of the town's youth outreach program. He was not speaking to me. He was listing the assets of his defense. I know, I whispered. But he did. And these alleged incidents, he continued, the word alleged a slap in the face. When did they take place? Were there any witnesses? No. We were always alone, after school. I see. He tapped a pen on the pristine blotter on his desk. Your teachers have informed me that you've been struggling this semester, Lily. Your grades have dropped significantly. They say you seem distracted, withdrawn. Have you been feeling overwhelmed lately? A lot of pressure? He was taking the symptoms of my trauma and twisting them into a motive for my lie. He was building a case against me, right in front of my eyes. The fragile flame of my resolve began to flicker and die, starved of oxygen in this cold, sterile room. This is a very serious accusation, Lily, he said, his voice taking on a paternal, condescending tone. A very serious thing to say about a man's career, about his life. He made it sound as though Thorne were the victim, his reputation the thing that was truly at risk. He leaned back in his chair, the picture of sober authority. The verdict had been reached. The pressures of being a teenager, especially one as bright as you, can be immense. Sometimes, young women. He trailed off, letting the insinuation hang in the air. He stood up, a clear dismissal. "I will look into it," he said, the words a hollow, meaningless promise. He walked to the door and held it open for me. As I stepped past him, a bundle of raw nerves and shattered hope, he placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. The touch made my skin crawl. "Lily," he said, his voice now soft, conspiratorial, and infinitely more cruel than a shout would have been. "Girls in your state of mind under this kind of pressure, they can sometimes create stories to get attention." The heavy oak door clicked shut behind me, the sound as final as a gavel strike. I stood alone in the empty hallway, the muffled ticking of the clock still audible through the wood. He hadn't just disbelieved me. He had diagnosed me. I wasn't a victim. I was a hysterical, attention-seeking, troubled girl. The system I had been raised to trust, the authority I had been taught to respect, had not just failed me. It had judged me, condemned me, and taken the side of the monster. The flicker of fight inside me was extinguished, plunged into a darkness deeper and more absolute than any I had known before. I was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The walk home was a descent into a new kind of hell. The sharp-edged despair I'd felt in Principal Thompson's office softened into a thick, suffocating numbness. The world was muted again, but this time it wasn't a dissociative float. It was a crushing weight. Each step was heavy. The front door of my house, with its glossy black paint and polished brass knocker, looked like the entrance to a mausoleum. There was only one path left, one final desperate appeal. The principal, the school, they were institutions, they were strangers. But a mother was supposed to be different. The biological imperative, the primal bond I'd read about in books, it had to count for something. It had to be stronger than shame. It had to. I found her in the living room. The afternoon sun streamed through the large bay window, illuminating the dustless air and glinting off the surfaces of polished wood and silver. The room was perfect, as always, a stage awaiting a drama. Eleanor was seated at the antique secretary desk, a silver fountain pen moving gracefully across a stack of cream-colored note cards. She was writing thank-you notes for a recent dinner party, an essential ritual in the maintenance of her social standing. She looked up as I entered, her brow furrowing slightly at my disheveled appearance. "You look a fright, Lily," she said, her voice crisp. "Did you run all the way home?" I didn't answer. I walked to the center of the room and stood there, trembling. She sighed, placing her pen down with deliberate care. "What is it now? If this is about your grades again, I've already said everything I have to say." "It's not about my grades," I managed to say, my voice raw. The story came out of me in a broken, pleading torrent. It was not the fragmented confession I had given Thompson. This was a daughter's desperate, keening cry for help. I told her everything, leaving nothing out, the ugly words spilling into the pristine silence of her perfect room. I told her about the office, the exercises, the manipulation, the fear. When I was done with that, I told her about the school, about Principal Thompson's cold dismissal, about being called a liar. I was weeping openly now, the tears I had held back all day finally breaking free. I sank to my knees on the expensive oriental rug, my body unable to hold the weight of it all anymore. And then I confessed the final catastrophic truth. "And Mama," I sobbed, the childish name slipping out in my desperation. "I'm pregnant." The words fell into the room and died. For a long moment, there was only a terrifying, absolute silence, broken by the sound of my own ragged breaths. Eleanor did not move. She did not rush to me. She did not gasp. She sat at her desk, her back ramrod straight, her face a blank white mask. I watched as her eyes, cold and calculating, processed the information. She was not seeing her broken, terrified daughter on the floor. She was looking at a bomb that had just detonated in the center of her carefully constructed life, assessing the blast radius, calculating the damage to her reputation. When she finally spoke, her voice was not a mother's. It was the voice of a surgeon diagnosing a malignancy. "Get up," she said. The command was flat, devoid of any emotion. I struggled to my feet, my legs shaking. "Marcus Thorne," she said, her voice a low, dangerous hiss. You are telling me you let the school's most respected counselor, a man whose wife chairs the hospital auxiliary board with me, do this to you? The accusation was already there, in the phrasing. You let this happen. I didn't let him, I whispered. Be quiet, she snapped, and the mask of calm finally cracked, revealing the cold fury beneath. Do you have any idea what you have done? What something like this would mean? Our name in this town. It would be worthless. Everything your father and I have worked for, everything we have built, would be dragged through the mud because his foolish, slutty daughter couldn't keep her legs closed. The word slutty struck me with the force of a physical blow. I recoiled, a strangled noise escaping my throat. Oh, don't look so shocked, she sneered, her eyes glittering with a venom I had never seen before. You expect me to believe you're some innocent little victim in all this? You, with your sullen moods and your secret scribblings. You probably threw yourself at him. A man like that, a family man, he wouldn't risk everything unless he was led on, tempted by a cheap little tramp. She was turning the world inside out, recasting the monster as the victim and me, his prey, as the predator. She was protecting him. She was protecting her social standing. She was protecting everything in the world except for her own child. He's a liar, I cried, the words tearing from my throat. I'm not the liar, he is. You are the one who has brought this filth into my home, she retorted, standing up and sweeping across the room to loom over me. Her face was a mask of disgust. You are the liar. You are the problem. You are a stain on this family, and I will not allow you to ruin us. Her rage was not hot. It was a blade of ice, carving me up with a chilling precision. The last desperate hope in me died, leaving behind a void so vast and cold it threatened to swallow me whole. This was my mother. And she hated me. She hated me because my trauma was an inconvenience. She turned away from me, her back once again perfectly straight, her composure restored into a mask of cold, terrifying resolve. She walked back to her desk, but she didn't sit. She stood there, a general surveying a battlefield, her mind already formulating a strategy. You will not tell anyone else about this, she said, her voice flat and final. Not your father, not your friends, not another soul. Do you understand me? I could only nod, my body shaking with silent, racking sobs. She looked at me one last time, her eyes completely empty of love, of pity, of anything remotely maternal. They were the eyes of a stranger, deciding on the most efficient way to dispose of a problem. You will not ruin this family, she stated, her voice dropping to a near whisper that was more menacing than any shout. I will handle this. She then turned her back on me completely, picked up the receiver of the telephone, and began to dial. She was not calling the police. She was not calling a doctor. She was calling an ally, a co-conspirator. She was beginning the cover-up. And I was left standing alone in the center of the beautiful, sunlit living room, a ghost in my own home, finally understanding the true meaning of betrayal. It was not the act of an enemy. It was the refusal of a mother to save her child. The telephone call was brief. From my crumpled position on the living room floor, I heard the controlled, melodic murmur of my mother's voice, a sound I knew she used for business and social maneuvering. It was the voice of a woman negotiating terms, not the voice of a mother in crisis. There was no panic in it, only the cool, crisp efficiency of a problem being solved. When she hung up, the silence that fell was different. It was no longer the silence of shock, but the silence of a decision made. An arrangement had been struck. My life in the house on Sycamore Lane changed overnight. My mother's cold fury, which had been so terrifyingly direct, was replaced by something far more sinister, a detached, clinical pity. She began to speak of my condition, as one would speak of a chronic but manageable illness. I was no longer a person. I was a project. The house, my gilded cage, now became my hospital, my cell. I was not allowed to return to school. The official story, a masterpiece of collaborative fiction woven between my mother and Principal Thompson, was that I was suffering from nervous exhaustion. It was a brilliant, tragically plausible lie. It neatly explained my failing grades, my withdrawn behavior, and my sudden absence. It painted the school as compassionate and my family as caring and proactive. Most importantly, it completely exonerated Marcus Thorne. In this new narrative, he was recast as the heroic, concerned counselor who had first noticed my instability and had tried his best to help me. He was the one who had alerted my parents. He was a saint. I didn't have to imagine the phone call between Eleanor and Thompson. I could see its results in every sympathetic, pitying look I received from the few adults I saw. I could feel it in the way the world was being rearranged around me, the truth buried under layers of careful, reputation-saving lies. One afternoon, I saw them together. My mother and him. I was looking out my bedroom window when a car I didn't recognize pulled up across the street. A few moments later, Mr. Thorne got out of his own car and walked over to it. The window rolled down, and he leaned in to speak with the driver. It was my mother. I could only see the back of her head, her perfectly coiffed hair. They were there for less than 5 minutes. It was not the meeting of a victim's mother and a predator. There were no raised voices, no angry gestures. It was calm, discreet, and transactional. It was the meeting of two co-conspirators finalizing the details of their unspoken arrangement. He was thanking her for her silence. She was ensuring his cooperation. They were allies, bound by a mutual interest in erasing me. When he walked away and drove off, my mother's car remained for a long moment before pulling smoothly from the curb and disappearing down the street. My father was brought into the conspiracy with a quiet after-dinner conversation. I was in the upstairs hallway, pretending to look for a book, and I heard my mother's calm, measured tones from the living room. "Richard, dear," she said, "I'm afraid Lily is quite unwell. It's a nervous condition. Principal Thompson and I have discussed it, and we all agree, with medical advice, that she needs to go away for a while, to a quiet place in the countryside where she can rest and recover." I waited for my father's protest, for a flicker of concern, for a single question. There was none. I heard the rustle of his newspaper being lowered, a pause, and then his reply, weary and resigned. "If you think that's what's best, Eleanor." It was the voice of a man relieved that a problem he did not want to confront was being taken care of by someone else. His passivity was no longer just a weakness. It was an act of profound betrayal. He was signing my order of exile without a second thought. My isolation was now complete. My friends' calls were intercepted by my mother. "Lily is resting," she would say, her voice dripping with false sympathy. "The doctor says she needs absolute quiet." The world I knew was being systematically dismantled, its bridges pulled up one by one. I was a prisoner in my own home, a ghost haunting the hallways, watching the architects of my destruction move around me with a calm, purposeful resolve. I was no longer angry. The rage I had felt in the bathroom had been burned out, leaving only a cold, hollow emptiness. I was watching my own life being stolen from me, my identity rewritten, my truth discarded like a piece of trash. They weren't just hiding a pregnancy, they were erasing a crime. They were erasing me. And they were doing it with the quiet, efficient politeness of good society. A few days later, my mother came into my room. She did not sit on the bed. She stood near the door, a brochure in her hand. "I've found a place," she said, her tone bright and brittle. "St. Jude's. It's a wonderful private home in the countryside, for young women who need rest and specialized care. You'll be very comfortable there." She held out the brochure. The picture on the front was of a serene-looking brick building surrounded by trees. It looked like a sanatorium, a place where inconvenient people were sent to be forgotten. I knew with a certainty that chilled me to the bone what kind of specialized care they offered. It was a place to hide pregnant girls until their problem could be quietly and permanently solved. "You'll leave on Saturday," she said. It was not a question, it was a sentence. "We've already made all the arrangements." I looked at her, at this woman who was my mother, this stranger who was sending me away to protect a monster and a family name. I saw no regret in her eyes, no sadness, only the grim, satisfied expression of a woman who had successfully managed a crisis. The unspoken arrangement was now spoken, and I, in my silence, had no choice but to agree to its terms. My exile was about to begin. The car ride was silent. My mother drove, her eyes fixed on the road, her profile as rigid and unyielding as a Roman coin. I sat beside her, watching the familiar landscape of Havenwood dissolve into rolling hills and unfamiliar farmland. We were not a mother and daughter driving to the country. We were a warden transporting a prisoner. The brochure had lied. St. Jude's home for unwed mothers was not a serene country retreat. It was a grim, 3-story brick building set far back from the road, surrounded by a wire fence and acres of gray, unforgiving fields. It smelled of boiled cabbage, antiseptic, and quiet desperation. The months I spent there blurred into a monotonous gray haze. We were a small, silent herd of disgraced girls, our swelling bellies the only thing we had in common. We were known by our first names only, our pasts and futures irrelevant. We existed in a state of suspended animation, waiting. We cleaned, we sewed, we attended mandatory, non-denominational chapel services where we prayed for forgiveness for sins we hadn't committed. The nurses were not unkind, but they were distant, their movements efficient, their expressions carefully neutral. We were not patients to be healed. We were problems to be managed until the day of our delivery. I retreated so far into myself that I barely spoke a word. I was a walking tomb, carrying the evidence of a crime no one would name. But as my body changed, something unexpected began to happen. A tiny flutter, then a kick. A persistent living presence that made itself known. Against all my efforts to feel nothing, a fierce protective love began to grow in the barren wasteland of my soul. This child, this secret inside me, was not a problem. She was not a shame. She was mine. She was the only real thing in a world of lies, a tiny, innocent ally in my profound isolation. The birth, when it came, was a storm of pain that tore through the numbness and made me brutally, terrifyingly alive. And then, through the haze of exhaustion, I heard it. A thin, reedy cry that cut through the sterile silence of the delivery room. A nurse placed a small, swaddled bundle into my arms. And the world, which had been gray for so long, exploded into color. She was perfect, a tiny, miraculous creature with a fuzz of dark hair and a furious, wrinkled face. I counted her fingers and toes. I studied the miniature seashell of her ear. I laid her on my chest and felt the impossible weight of her, the warmth of her breath against my skin. The profound, hollow ache inside me was filled. For the first time in almost a year, I was not alone. For 3 days, we lived in a sacred, stolen bubble of time. I did not sleep. I just watched her, memorizing every detail, every tiny sound she made. In the quiet of the night, when the only sound was the rustling of the wind in the trees outside the barred window, I would whisper her name to her, a secret just between us. Hope. I named her Hope. It was an act of desperate, defiant love. It was the only thing I could give her, a name to tether her to me, a name to carry into the life I knew she would not share with me. On the 4th day, the bubble burst. A nurse came in, her expression full of a professional pity I had come to dread. "You have a visitor, Lily," she said. My mother stood in the doorway. She was dressed in a smart navy suit, her handbag clutched in her gloved hands. She looked as if she had come for a business meeting. Her eyes glanced at the baby in my arms and then quickly away, as if looking too long might contaminate her. She was not alone. Behind her stood a man in a gray suit, holding a briefcase. He had the bland, impassive face of someone paid to witness human misery without feeling it. The lawyer. "Lily," my mother said, her voice soft but firm. "We need to sign the papers." I clutched Hope tighter to my chest. "No." The lawyer stepped forward and opened his briefcase on the small bedside table, extracting a sheaf of documents and a pen. My mother came to the side of the bed. "Don't be difficult," she said, her voice dropping lower. "This is for the best." "You know it is. What can you possibly offer this child? You have no money, no education, no home. You are a child yourself." "She's my daughter," I choked out, tears blurring my vision. "And if you love her," my mother said, her voice a blade of cold, irrefutable logic, "you will give her a chance at a real life, a life with a proper family. A mother and a father, a home without shame. This is the only truly unselfish thing you can do for her, Lily. Don't ruin her life before it has even begun, just to satisfy your own sentimentality. She was twisting my love for my child into a weapon to be used against me. She was making my surrender an act of maternal grace. The lawyer pushed the papers and the pen towards me. "Sign here," he said, his voice as colorless as his suit, pointing to a line at the bottom of the page. I looked from his impassive face to my mother's resolute one. I looked down at the tiny sleeping face of my daughter, so peaceful, so unaware. They were right. I had nothing. I was nothing. To keep her would be to condemn her to my own broken life. My love for her was a fierce, burning agony, and the greatest expression of that love was to let her go. My hand, guided by a force that was not my own, took the pen. The scratch it made on the paper was the sound of my heart tearing in two. I signed my name. I signed away my hope. It was over in an instant. The lawyer gathered the papers, placed them in his briefcase, and left without another word. A moment later, the nurse returned. She approached the bed, her hands outstretched. "It's time," she said softly. "No," I whispered, my body curling around my daughter. "Please." But the nurse was gentle and firm. Her hands closed around the warm, swaddled bundle. I tried to hold on, my muscles locking in a silent, primal scream of protest. But I was weak, and she was strong. She lifted my baby from my arms. The warmth was gone. The weight was gone. My arms, which seconds before had been full, were now empty. They were a hollow cradle. The nurse walked out of the room carrying my entire world with her. The door clicked shut. I sat there alone in the sterile room. I did not scream. I did not cry. There were no tears left. A part of my soul had been scooped out, leaving a void from which no sound could ever emerge. I simply stared at the closed door, my arms still curled into the shape of the child they no longer held. I had broken. Completely. And in the silent, echoing ruin of my heart, I knew I would never, ever be whole again. I was kept at St. Jude's for another week, a period of quarantine for my soul. I was an empty vessel, a hollowed-out shell. I moved when I was told to move, ate what I was given, and stared for hours at the blank wall opposite my bed. The nurses treated me with a gentle, distant pity, the kind reserved for the irrevocably broken. Hope was gone. My body knew it. My arms ached with an phantom weight. The world had returned to its gray, muted state, but now the silence was absolute. My mother came for me on a Tuesday. She did not come to take me home. She came with a cheap suitcase containing a few of my clothes and a bus ticket. She did not ask me how I was. She did not mention the baby. The problem had been handled, and the next step of the arrangement was underway. "You won't be coming back to Havenwood," she said, her voice brisk and matter-of-fact. She stood by the door of my room, refusing to step fully inside. "It would be too difficult, and it's best to let the story of your illness fade away naturally. People will forget." I stared at her, my mind a slow, thick fog. "Forgetting was the entire point. Your father's sister, Martha, has agreed to have you," she continued. "She lives in Nebraska. It's a quiet town. You'll be able to finish your schooling there. Start over." She made it sound like an opportunity, a generous gift. It was a life sentence in Exile. The bus station was a grimy, transient purgatory, smelling of diesel fumes and stale popcorn. It was a place for people with no attachments, people who could fit their lives into a single bag. It was the perfect place for me. My mother led me to a plastic chair and handed me the ticket and a thick envelope. "This is cash," she said, her voice low. "It should be enough for the first few months. A similar amount will be wired to Martha's bank account for you at the beginning of each month. It's your allowance. Use it for your needs. Don't call us asking for more." I was being pensioned off, paid for my silence and my absence. "Your instructions are simple," she said, her eyes cold and direct. "You will be quiet. You will be respectful to your aunt. You will finish school. You will not, under any circumstances, speak of what has happened to anyone, ever. Do not cause any more trouble, Lily. We have been through enough." She looked at her watch. Your bus will be here in 10 minutes. I have an appointment. She did not hug me. She did not touch me. She did not say goodbye. She simply turned, her heels clicking on the grimy linoleum floor, and walked out of the bus station without a backward glance, leaving me alone with my suitcase and my ticket to nowhere. The journey was a long, rattling blur of unfamiliar highways and anonymous towns. Nebraska was as flat and featureless as my own future. My great-aunt Martha lived in a small, tidy house on a street where every house looked the same. She was a thin, wiry woman with my father's quiet disposition, but none of his weakness. She was practical and unsentimental. She showed me to my room, a small, plain space with a narrow bed and a view of the neighbor's fence. There was an unspoken agreement between us from the moment I arrived. She would provide me with a roof over my head, and I would be an unobtrusive ghost in her home. We did not speak of my parents. We did not speak of why I was there. The past was a locked room, and neither of us had any intention of opening the door. My life became a routine of profound emptiness. I enrolled in the local high school, where I was a complete unknown. I spoke to no one, and no one spoke to me. I took long walks through the quiet, grid-like streets of the town. I got a library card and read my way through shelves of books, losing myself in other people's stories because my own was unbearable. I was a phantom, haunting the edges of a life that wasn't mine, my existence funded by the monthly payments that were both my lifeline and my chain. The final fatal blow to what little remained of my past came on a cold night about a month after I arrived. The walls of Martha's house were thin. I was lying in the dark of my room when I heard her on the telephone in the hallway. Her voice had the polite, slightly strained tone she only used when speaking to my mother. My heart began to beat a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. I slipped out of bed and pressed my ear to the cold wood of the door. I could only hear Martha's side of the conversation. "Yes, Eleanor, she's fine. No, she doesn't say much. Keeps to herself. Yes, the money arrived on the 1st, thank you. It's very generous." There was a long pause, and I could imagine my mother's voice on the other end, cool and controlled. Martha listened for a long time. Then she sighed, a sound of weary resignation. "Well, yes," Martha said, her voice full of a tired, practical sympathy that was meant for my mother, not for me. "I'm sure it's a great relief to have that whole problem handled and behind you now. It truly is for the best. That whole problem handled." The words were not meant for me, but they shot through the door and pierced me to the core. My baby. My hope, a life, a person. A daughter, reduced to a problem, an inconvenience that had been handled like a leaky faucet or an overdue bill, and my mother's relief so profound that my aunt could hear it in her voice from 1,000 miles away was the final, definitive proof. There was no lingering sadness, no hidden grief, only the satisfaction of a crisis successfully managed. I backed away from the door and stumbled to my bed. I did not cry. The capacity for tears had been burned out of me at St. Jude's. The space they had occupied was now filled with something else, something cold and hard and heavy. It was the absolute certain knowledge that I was utterly and completely alone. Every bond had been severed. Every last, lingering shred of hope that my family might one day feel remorse, that my mother might one day see me as a daughter instead of a disgrace, was gone. It had been a foolish, childish hope anyway. I sat in the darkness of that small, anonymous room in a town I didn't know, a ghost paid to stay silent. The last ember of the girl I had been was finally extinguished. There was nothing left now but a cold, dark void. I did not know it then, but it is in such perfect, absolute emptiness that the seeds of a patient, terrible resolve can finally begin to take root. The girl who was exiled to Nebraska ceased to exist the day she turned 18. On that day, the monthly payments from my mother stopped, as did the pretense of my great-aunt Martha's guardianship. I was legally an adult, untethered and utterly alone. I graduated from the local high school, a silent figure in a cap and gown, shaking no hands and posing for no pictures. I was a ghost, and I intended to stay that way. The world expected me to build a life, to find a career, a husband, a home. I did none of those things, not in the way the world understood them. Instead, I sought refuge in the one place where the past was treated with quiet, orderly respect. The library. I enrolled in the State University and studied library science, then archival studies. The work suited the hollow space inside me. I learned to handle fragile, yellowed documents, to categorize the lives of others, to preserve their stories in silent, climate-controlled rooms. The dust of ages was my companion, the quiet hum of the archives my sanctuary. This was a sanctuary of my own making, one with no hidden locks, no predator masquerading as a savior. I lived a life of deliberate emptiness. My small apartment was neat, monastic. I had no close friends, no lovers. Closeness was a currency I no longer possessed and a danger I would not risk. I watched the lives of others from a distance, the young couples holding hands, the parents pushing strollers in the park, with the detached curiosity of a naturalist observing a foreign species. Their joys and sorrows were a language I no longer spoke. The wound inside me had not healed. It had scarred over, forming a hard, protective shell around the void where my heart used to be. I was a ghost, yes, but a ghost with a library card and access to the quiet, formidable power of recorded history. And I was not idle. In the quiet solitude of my new life, I began my true education. It started with a subscription to the Havenwood Herald. The first time the flimsy, newsprint-wrapped paper arrived at my drab apartment, it felt like holding a scorpion. With trembling hands, I unrolled it, and there they were. My mother Eleanor smiling from the society page, chairing a fundraiser for the Children's Hospital. The irony was a physical sickness in my throat. I cut the picture out with a pair of scissors and placed it in a simple, unmarked cardboard box. It was the first entry in my own secret archive. For 20 years, the Herald was my only link to the world I had been banished from. I followed their lives from afar, a silent, unseen chronicler of their triumphs. I saw Mr. Thorne promoted to head of guidance, his photograph accompanying an article where he spoke passionately about the importance of creating a safe, trusting environment for students. I read about his children, a boy and a girl, their names appearing regularly for making the honor roll or scoring the winning goal. Each mention was another drop of slow, cold poison into my soul. I clipped them all. In my 30s, when the internet made the world smaller, my research deepened. One night, I typed my father's name into a search engine. His obituary appeared on the screen. He had died of a heart attack. The text described him as a beloved husband and a pillar of the community. It ended with the grotesque, required lie. He is survived by his loving wife, Eleanor, and his devoted daughter, Lily. I felt nothing. No grief, no sadness. Just the cold, clinical recognition of a fact. A ghost from my past was now a literal one. I saved a digital copy of the obituary and filed it away. As I moved into my 40s, my professional skills became my tools. I was an archivist. I knew how to find things. I learned to navigate online public records. I found property deeds for the Thorne family, noting the escalating value of their homes. I found the incorporation papers for the charities my mother sat on the boards of, studying their financial statements. I found wedding announcements for Thorne's children, class reunion photos, digital versions of old high school yearbooks. I was not looking for a single piece of evidence to prove my own story. That story was dead and buried. I was doing something else. I was studying the architecture of their lives, the pristine, public-facing facades they presented to the world. And every architect knows that to understand how to demolish a building, you must first study its blueprints, find its weight-bearing walls, and identify its hidden, structural weaknesses. One evening, I sat in my quiet apartment, the contents of the cardboard box spread before me, the glow of my laptop illuminating my face. On the screen was a new article from the Herald. Marcus Thorne was being honored with the Mayor's Lifetime Achievement Award for community service. The photograph showed him as he was now. A handsome, silver-haired man in his late 60s, his arm around his smiling wife, flanked by his successful, adoring children. He was the patriarch of a perfect family, a revered icon, a man whose entire life of public virtue was built upon the bedrock of my private hell, on the silence of a broken girl, and on the ghost of a child named Hope. Looking at that picture, I felt the last vestiges of the victim inside me die. The hollow ache that had been my constant companion for 3 decades did not disappear. It crystallized. It sharpened into a single, diamond-hard point of purpose. The universe, I understood with absolute clarity, did not balance its own scales. Justice was not a cosmic force. It was a human verb, an action. It was then that I made my vow. It was not a vow of vengeance whispered in a moment of passion. It was a cold, silent promise made to the ghost I had become. They live in the sun, I thought, my eyes fixed on Thorne's smiling face. Their warmth is fueled by my darkness. They think the story is over. They think I am a problem that was handled. But they are wrong. I am the archivist of their sins, and the archivist always, always gets the final word. I will not seek justice. Justice is a prayer whispered to a deaf system. I will deliver a reckoning. Not with a scream that they can dismiss as madness, but with a quiet, precise whisper of truth that will make the foundations of their perfect lives crumble. I will not be the storm that destroys them. I will simply be the gentle, persistent wind that reveals the rot in their walls, and I will watch them fall. I calmly gathered the clippings and photographs, placing them back in their box. I closed the laptop. My hands were steady. The hollow girl was gone. The waiting ghost now had a mission. The long, patient years of study were over. The era of planning could now begin. 50 years is a long time to wait. It is long enough for a ghost to learn patience, long enough for grief to petrify into purpose. I returned to Oregon not as the broken girl who had been exiled, but as a woman of 70, an archivist with a singular, long-term project reaching its final stage. I settled in Portland, a city of strangers, just an hour's drive from Havenwood, but a world away. From the quiet, minimalist sanctuary of my apartment, I watched, and I waited for the perfect alignment of circumstances. The moment when the life Mr. Thorne had built would be at its most magnificent, and therefore, its most fragile. That moment arrived in the spring of the year I turned 71. It came in the form of 2 articles, published on the same day in the online edition of the Havenwood Herald. The first announced that the town council had unanimously approved the naming of the new civic building, the Marcus Thorne Community Center. It was to be a celebration of his life's work, his decades of service. The article was accompanied by a recent photograph of him, now a handsome, silver-haired patriarch, the very picture of benevolent wisdom. The second article concerned his son. Jonathan Thorne, a charismatic lawyer with his father's smile and my mother's ambition, was the frontrunner in the mayoral race. He was running on a platform of family values and fiscal responsibility, his campaign heavily leveraging his father's unimpeachable reputation. Reading the news on my tablet, I felt no rage, I felt no satisfaction. I felt only the calm, quiet click of a lock falling into place. The monument was at its highest point. The legacy was poised to create a dynasty. The stage was perfectly set. My work began that evening. It was the work of a puppeteer preparing her strings, an archivist curating her final, devastating exhibition. At a 24-hour copy shop miles from my home, wearing thin latex gloves, I printed the documents I had spent decades gathering and years organizing. The embezzlement had been my greatest find, a product of cross-referencing years of the Havenwood Youth Fund's publicly available tax filings with their glossy annual reports. Thorne had been careful. The amounts were small, disguised as discretionary outreach expenses or consulting fees, paid to a shell company I had traced back to a post office box he controlled. Individually, they were insignificant, but together, laid out chronologically, they showed a clear, undeniable pattern of deceit, a slow, steady siphoning from the very children he claimed to champion. The affair was a more recent discovery, a product of the digital age's carelessness. A discarded cell phone bill found in a public database, showing dozens of late-night calls to a number belonging to a woman half his age, a junior faculty member at the local college. A single, grainy photograph I had paid a private investigator to take from a distance, showing the two of them sharing a far too intimate lunch. It was circumstantial, but paired with the calls, it was damning. I prepared 2 separate, anonymous packages. My methods were meticulous, learned from a lifetime of caution. I used a public library computer to create 2 different anonymous email accounts. The first email went to Sarah Jennings, Jonathan Thorne's chief rival in the mayoral race. I had studied her for months. She was a pit bull, an ambitious councilwoman running on an anti-corruption platform. Her campaign slogan was, "A new voice for Havenwood." The subject line of my email was simple: "For a new voice." The body of the email contained only a link to a secure, anonymous cloud folder containing the scanned financial documents. The evidence of embezzlement. I knew she would not be able to resist. The second email, sent 30 minutes later from the other account, went to a local independent blogger who ran a site called Havenwood Confidential. His brand was gossip and outrage, and his standards of journalistic verification were non-existent. The subject line was even simpler: "A pillar of the community." The attached file was the photo of Thorne and his mistress, along with the call logs. Then, I went home. I made myself a cup of chamomile tea, sat by my window, and watched the city lights blink on as evening fell. I had lit 2 separate, slow-burning fuses at opposite ends of Marcus Thorne's life. Now, all I had to do was wait for them to reach the powder keg. The first explosion came 2 days later. Sarah Jennings did not leak the documents. She was smarter than that. She called a press conference on the steps of Town Hall. With a grave expression, she announced that her office had uncovered deeply troubling financial irregularities in the Havenwood Youth Fund's accounts, spanning more than 15 years. She called for an immediate, independent forensic audit of the charity and questioned the oversight of its board members, a board on which Jonathan Thorne had proudly served for the last 5 years. She never mentioned Marcus Thorne by name, but she didn't have to. The connection was made. The seed of doubt was planted, implicating both father and son. The second explosion came the following evening. Havenwood Confidential published its story. The grainy photo was the headline image. The article was salacious, filled with innuendo and speculation about the hypocrisy of our town's most sainted icon. It spread through the community's social media feeds like a virus. The effect was exactly what I had designed. 2 scandals erupting almost simultaneously from seemingly unrelated corners of the universe. The financial story looked like a calculated political hit job by Sarah Jennings. The affair looked like the work of a scorned mistress or a muckraking blogger. The Thorne family was plunged into a maelstrom of chaos and paranoia. I read the online articles detailing the fallout. Marcus Thorne issued a furious denial of all baseless allegations, calling it a disgusting smear campaign orchestrated by his son's political enemies. I saw a picture of Jonathan Thorne at a press conference, his confident smile replaced by a tight, panicked grimace as he tried to distance his campaign from the unfounded attacks on his father. They were looking everywhere for the enemy. They suspected Sarah Jennings. They suspected the mistress. They probably suspected rivals on the charity board. They were turning on each other, drowning in a sea of paranoia. They were looking for a powerful, visible enemy. They never once thought to look for the ghost of a forgotten girl, the quiet archivist sitting in a sterile apartment an hour away, the puppeteer watching calmly as her puppets began to dance on the strings she had so patiently and so precisely laid. The house of cards was beginning to sway. The carefully constructed world of Marcus Thorne did not collapse in a single mighty crash. It fell apart piece by piece. A slow, agonizing demolition played out in the public square and in the suffocating privacy of his own home. The twin scandals born from my anonymous whispers fed on each other, creating a feedback loop of disgrace that was impossible to contain. The forensic audit of the Havenwood Youth Fund was a daily humiliation. News vans parked outside the charity's small office, filming boxes of financial records being loaded into vans by stone-faced accountants. The process was methodical and transparent, and every day it remained in the headlines was another day. My poison seeped deeper into the town's consciousness. The story of the affair, meanwhile, had taken on a life of its own, a sordid soap opera whispered about in grocery store aisles and dissected on community forums. The first great pillar of his legacy to fall was the community center. The town council convened an emergency session. It was a public spectacle. One by one, council members who had praised Thorne as a living saint just weeks before now spoke in grave tones about the need to uphold public trust, and the shadow cast by these serious and credible allegations. The vote was unanimous. The motion to name the building the Marcus Thorne Community Center was indefinitely suspended. The monument to his life was torn down before the dedication plaque could even be engraved. The private collapse was quieter, but infinitely more brutal. His wife, Catherine, a woman whose entire identity was interwoven with his, endured the initial storm with a rigid public stoicism. But the combination of financial deceit and personal infidelity was an intolerable 1-2 punch to her pride. I pictured the scene as I imagined it would be, not a screaming match, but a final icy conversation in their perfect, cathedral-like living room. I saw her standing by a packed suitcase, her face pale but resolute. "I defended you, Marcus," I heard her say in my mind. "I smiled at the country club and told everyone these were vicious lies, but the audit is real, the affair is real. You have made me a fool. I will not be the pitiable wife who stands by the disgraced man." With that, the 50-year partnership that had been the bedrock of his social standing was dissolved. She left, and the house, once a bustling hub of social importance, became a vast, silent tomb. The most devastating blow, however, was reserved for his son. Jonathan Thorne's mayoral campaign imploded with spectacular speed. His family values platform became a bitter joke. His funding dried up. In a single, excruciating press conference, his face a tight mask of humiliation, he announced he was suspending his campaign. The dream his father had nurtured in him his entire life, the dynasty he was meant to build on the Thorne name, had turned to ash in his mouth. That night, the final wall of the House of Cards came down. I had researched these men for decades. I knew their dynamics, their prides, and their vanities. I could write the scene in my head before it even happened. Jonathan, his political career in ruins, would go to his father, not for comfort, but for a final, terrible accounting. I saw him entering the grand living room, where Marcus sat alone amid the wreckage of his life, a half-empty bottle of expensive whiskey on the table beside him. "It's over," Jonathan would say, his voice devoid of emotion. "The campaign, everything. It was a political hit," Marcus would rasp, his voice thick with self-pity and alcohol. "Jennings and her muckrakers, they assassinated me." A cold, humorless laugh would escape Jonathan's lips. "Did Sarah Jennings steal from a children's charity every year for 2 decades? Did she force me to go on television and talk about your integrity while she was sleeping with one of her students? I defended you. I stood in front of the cameras, and I lied for you. And you let me." He would step closer, his voice dropping to a furious, shaking whisper. "All my life, it was about the Thorne name, the legacy. My duty to uphold it. You drilled it into me, and the whole time, you were a fraud. A cheap, lying hypocrite." He would lean in, the son's face inches from the father's, the love and adoration of a lifetime curdled into pure contempt. "You didn't just destroy my career. You destroyed the only thing I ever believed in." Which was you. The judgment of his own son, the living embodiment of his legacy, was a punishment more absolute than any court could ever deliver. Marcus Thorne had not just lost his reputation, his wife, his good name. He had lost the love and respect of the one person whose opinion mattered more than all the others combined. He was left a broken, disgraced old man, a king deposed in his own empty castle, forever trapped in a paranoid maze, cursing the enemies he could see, never once suspecting the invisible ghost who had orchestrated it all. From my quiet apartment in Portland, I followed the news on my tablet. I read the sterile, factual report of Jonathan Thorne suspending his campaign. I read the minutes of the town council meeting. I saw the pictures of Catherine Thorne's car packed with suitcases outside their house. My work was done. The scales had been balanced. I felt no joy, no triumph. I felt only the quiet, profound satisfaction of a long and complicated task brought to its meticulous conclusion. I took a sip of my tea. The house of cards had fallen, and the puppeteer had already put her strings away. The downfall of Marcus Thorne was a public spectacle, but my part in it was a private, silent epilogue. With his life in ruins, there was only one remaining entry in the ledger, one final account to be settled. A few weeks after the last newspaper article faded from view, I drove from Portland to the most exclusive and expensive nursing home in the region, a place called the Willows. It was where my mother now resided. The Willows was a perfect final cage for her. It had the familiar scent of wealth layered over the undeniable odor of decay. lemon polish and lavender potpourri, failing to mask the faint underlying smell of antiseptic and old age. The residents sat like elegant statues in plush armchairs, their bodies draped in cashmere, their eyes vacant. It was the end-of-life version of the country club, a place where appearances were maintained even as the mind and body failed. I found her in a private room with a view of a meticulously manicured garden. She was so much smaller than I remembered, a frail, shrunken bird lost in the depths of a wingback chair. The imperious posture was gone, her spine curved into a question mark. Her hands, which had once gestured with such sharp, commanding authority, lay spotted and still in her lap. Her eyes, cloudy with cataracts, stared out the window but saw nothing. I walked into the room and sat in the chair opposite her. She turned her head slowly, her gaze unfocused. There was no flicker of recognition. "Oh, hello, dear," she murmured, her voice a thin, papery rustle. "Have you come to check the linens?" The new girl is terribly careless. I did not correct her. I simply waited until her gaze settled on me, even if she didn't know who she was seeing. "No," I said, my voice calm and steady. "I've come to tell you a story." She blinked, her interest piqued by the novelty. "A story? How lovely." And so I began. I did not raise my voice. I did not use the word I or the word you. I spoke in the detached, precise tone of an archivist reading a historical record. "Once upon a time, there was a girl named Lily," I started. She was a quiet, artistic girl who lived in a beautiful house where everything was perfect, except for the love she never received. The girl was lonely, and so she was grateful when the school's kind, handsome guidance counselor took a special interest in her. I watched my mother's face as I spoke. There was nothing there but a placid, polite attentiveness. I continued the story, my voice a soft, relentless monotone. I told her of the sanctuary that became a prison, of the confidence-building exercises that became a secret sickness. I spoke of the day the girl realized she was pregnant, and the terror that drove her to the principal's office, where she was called an attention seeker. "And so," I said, leaning forward just slightly, "the girl went to the one person in the world she believed must save her. She went to her mother. She knelt on the floor and she confessed everything, believing that a mother's love was the one thing that could conquer all." But the girl's mother did not see her daughter's pain. She saw only the threat of a scandal. She saw a stain on the family's good name. A flicker of something, agitation, confusion, disturbed the placid surface of my mother's expression. The story was beginning to stir a faint, unsettling echo in the fog of her mind. I did not stop. I told her how the mother called the girl a liar and a slut. How the mother conspired with the school and the counselor to create a new story, a story about a mentally unstable girl having a nervous breakdown. I described the grim institution where the girl was sent, the birth of a baby she named Hope, and the day the mother arrived with a lawyer and a pen and forced the girl to sign her child away forever. I told her of the Exile and of the overheard phone call where the mother expressed her great relief that the problem had been handled. I finished the story and let the silence hang in the room. My mother was frowning now, her brow furrowed. She was wrestling with a phantom, a memory she couldn't quite grasp. "It's a sad story," I said softly. "Isn't it?" Then I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a near whisper, sharp and clear. "But it has a final chapter. Just last month, that same respected counselor, the man from the story, he lost everything. His name was taken off a new building. His wife left him. They say his own son, the one who was running for mayor, despises him now." I paused, holding her cloudy gaze. This was the bridge between the dead past and the living present. "A reputation," I said, each word a carefully placed stone, "it turns out, is a fragile thing." And then it happened. The fog in her eyes burned away. In a stunning, terrifying instant of pure lucidity, the clouds parted, and she saw me. Not a nurse, not a stranger, but me, Lily, the ghost of the daughter she had thrown away 50 years ago. Recognition flooded her face, followed by a wave of disbelief, and then a tsunami of absolute mind-shattering horror. She understood the story. She understood the epilogue. She understood who had authored Marcus Thorne's ruin. Her mouth opened, A silent, gaping "oh" of terror. Her body trembled in the chair. I had what I came for. It was not an apology. It was not a confession. It was this. This single, perfect moment of horrifying clarity. I stood up, my movements calm and deliberate. I smoothed the front of my coat. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the room, leaving her there, trapped in her chair, in her decaying body, in the wreckage of her mind. The lucidity would fade, I knew, but the terror I had planted in that moment of clarity would remain, a shard of ice in her soul, a final, horrifying truth to keep her company in the dark until the very end. The final word had been spoken, and it was mine. I drove away from the Willows as the sun was beginning to set, painting the Oregon sky in soft, bruised shades of purple and gray. I did not speed. I did not feel a rush of victorious adrenaline. I simply drove, my hands steady on the wheel, my eyes on the road ahead. The final ghost of my past had been faced, the final word spoken into the void. The great, heavy book of my history, the one I had been forced to carry for 50 years, had finally been closed. Back in my apartment, the quiet felt different. Before, it had been the quiet of vigilance, of solitude as a defense. Now, it was the quiet of a harbor after a long and violent storm. It was peace. I made myself a cup of tea, the simple, familiar ritual, a grounding anchor. I touched a leaf of my orchid, its single, perfect bloom, a testament to patient, silent growth. I sat in my chair by the window, the same chair where this story began, and watched the city lights ignite against the deepening twilight. The faces of the past flickered in my mind, Principal Thompson and his dismissive pity, my father and his cowardly retreat, Marcus Thorne, a broken king in a ruined castle, forever cursing the wrong enemies. My mother, a ghost in her own mind, trapped in a final, horrifying moment of clarity. Revenge, I have learned, is not sweet. It is not a hot, satisfying meal. It is a cold and precise form of accounting. It is the meticulous, silent settling of a debt that should never have existed in the first place. There was no joy in their ruin, only a grim sense of cosmic rebalancing, a feeling that the scales, so long tipped in their favor, were finally level. I did not destroy them with a storm. I simply held up a mirror, and they were shattered by the reflections of their own souls. And what of the first and most innocent victim in all this? What of the baby I named Hope? For many years, in the quietest hours of the night, I would search for her. I used my skills as an archivist to comb through sealed adoption records and public databases, looking for a trace, a clue, a sign of the life she had lived. There were times I thought I was close, but the trail always went cold, the records sealed by laws designed to protect families like the one that adopted her from ghosts like me. And then, one day, about a decade ago, I stopped searching. I realized that to find her would be the ultimate act of selfishness. It would mean taking the poison that had defined my life and injecting it into hers. It would mean burdening her with a story of such darkness that it could not help but cast a shadow over her own son. She had been given a chance at a life untouched by my trauma, a life free from the names Thorne and Anderson. Her not knowing was the only true sanctuary I could ever give her. It was the last, most painful, and most necessary act of motherly love. I pray she has been happy. I hope her life has been full of a genuine, easy warmth. I hope she has felt seen and cherished and safe. Perhaps my life of cold, patient resolve was the price the universe demanded for her life of simple, unknowing peace. If so, it is a price I have willingly paid. My story is not about forgiveness. Forgiveness is a gift, and the people who wronged me were not worthy of receiving one. My story is about reclamation. They took my body, my child, my voice, and my truth. They tried to rewrite my history and erase my name. It took me 50 years, but I took it all back. I took back the narrative they stole from me. My name is Lily Anderson. And finally, the silence is my own. I looked out the window, at the rain beginning to streak the glass, each droplet catching the light of the city below like a falling tear. I did not smile. But for the first time since I was a girl of 16, dreaming of a world made of charcoal and light, my soul was at peace,